Morning, church. It's good to be back from holidays. If I'm a little bit croaky, I apologise. Like a lot of people, still recovering from a bit of a cold. And big thanks to Byron for holding down the fort while I was away. And I know there were a couple of tricky passages and some long passages that I asked him to preach on, so many thanks for that. And you'll see a bit of that continuation as we keep going this morning in Genesis 22. If you're visiting us here for the first time, we're currently in the middle of a series on Genesis, on the book of beginnings, which is what Genesis means. And as our church is heading towards a season with a new senior pastor who's going to be starting in a few months' time, we thought it'd be good to go back, look at Genesis, look at God's beginnings, and see Jesus in Genesis the whole way through. And I think this passage, Genesis 22, as Leonie has pointed out, is pretty much the capstone of seeing Jesus in Genesis. It leads all the way up to it. But in this passage, there's a very interesting phrase that gets uttered 3 times. And two of those times it's uttered to God, and it is, "Here I am." Abraham says that to God. He says, "Here I am." And those are probably some of the most dangerous words you can utter, some of the most terrifying words you can utter, but also some of the most powerful words you can ever say. So we're going to look through this passage and see how that plays out and why we should have hearts that also cry out to God, "Here I am." So because this is a narrative, we're just going to follow it like a narrative, verse by verse, and just go down and see how it builds and what God has for us. So verse 1 of chapter 22 in Genesis. "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" So the first question when we look at this is, after these things, after what things? Right? It's a joiner. It tells us the things of the last couple of chapters lead up to this period where God's about to do something different in Abraham's life. And in the last chapter, in chapter 21, you find Abraham had a bit of strife, but you also find that Isaac, the promised child, was born. But in the middle of that joy, his firstborn child, Ishmael, is cast out. Sarah becomes very jealous of Hagar and of Ishmael, and he gets driven out. And so Abraham, in one sense, gains a son, the promised son, but also loses a son. So it's a bit of strife, a bit of trouble. But then you get down to verse 34 of chapter 21, and it says, "Abraham stayed there many days." And it's not just talking about days, it's talking about years, because when the narrative next picks up, you've got Isaac old enough to carry stuff on his back, old enough to ask smart questions of his dad. So Abraham's had this season of moving from Ur of the Chaldeans, moving all the way through. He's had some battles, he's had some fights, he's had a child, he's lost a child, he's had a new child, and then there's been this season finally of rest, possibly up to a decade of just joy, because Isaac's name means laughter. This nice period, this comfortable period, and then after all these things, in the middle of this period of comfort, God speaks. Now, it says God tested Abraham. Some of your older translations might say God tempted Abraham, but that's not a good translation, because James chapter 1 verse 13 makes it very clear God does not tempt anyone. He tests us so we can be refined, and so that we know and we can prove we are who we are in Him. But He doesn't tempt, because temptation is there to make you fall. Testing is there to make you stronger, right? God does not tempt, He tests. I think a kind of good example is when I was a kid, I used to love climbing trees. And as you start to get towards the higher branches and they start to get a little bit thin, you don't want to put your whole weight straight on a branch, because it might look good. The branch might look like it can hold your weight, but you're not sure. So what do? You put all your weight on another branch and you start to put a little bit more, until you've tested whether the branch can hold your weight. Now that's kind of what's going on here, but the difference here isn't that it's God trying to figure out if Abraham's a branch that's going to break, because God knows Abraham's heart. This is actually a testing, so Abraham knows whether he's going to break or not under these sort of situations. This is for Abraham's benefit. And the fact that we've got the word God tested Abraham in here is for our benefit, right? Abraham doesn't have the advantage of knowing that he's going into a time of testing, but we do, and that's important, because otherwise we could read this passage and think, oh, God wants Isaac dead. That this God of love suddenly wants child sacrifice. No, the fact that it puts God tested Abraham right at the top tells us God never had any intention that Isaac would be in any danger. That was not his plan. Isaac was always safe. God isn't going to break character. And this isn't a situation where God suddenly goes, oh, you were faithful, Abraham, so I guess Isaac lives. It's not like a last moment God changes his mind and goes, oh no, it's okay, Isaac. No, God always planned for Isaac to live. This was a test for Abraham. And I mentioned earlier, Abraham, when he replies to God, he just says, here I am. In this whole passage, that's all Abraham says to God. Right? He speaks to Isaac, has a long conversation with Isaac, with his servants. He talks to his servants. But with God, he just says, here I am. Contrast that with Genesis chapter 18, when you've got the whole Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham's arguing with God. He's bargaining with him. He's like, oh Lord, if there are 50 people, don't wipe the city out. Oh Lord, maybe if there are 20 people. What about if there are 5 people? You know, he has this big dialogue with God. But here, all he ever says to God is, here I am. Here I am. We've got no idea of his internal struggle. We've got no idea of the prayers that he's got, no idea of the fight, just here I am. I'm here. I'm ready. So for us, that tells us that there's time for both. There is times where we need to have it out with God, I guess. As Julie's been saying, you read the Psalms of David. Some of those where David says to God, you've smashed my teeth into the gravel. You've broken my joints, right? You've wrecked me, God. Where are you? Right? David's very accusatory and he wrestles with God. Abraham in Genesis 18 wrestles with God. But there are other times when God is very clear to us and he asks us to do something, and there's no more place for wrestling. There's no more place for denying, for delaying. It's just, here I am. And then we go. There's time for both. But we can't let one overtake the other. When it's time for action, action is required. Verse 2. And God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. There's a pretty clear command. Take your son and offer him on the mountain which I will show you. Right? It's a command, go and do this, but it's not this is the step-by-step process of how this is going to work out. At a later date, I'm going to show you which mountain I want you to do it on. Just go. Right? And I find that incredibly frustrating. I don't know if you do. When God makes something clear in my life and he's like, I want you to do this, but I'm not going to tell you how to get there. You're going to have to trust me for this. For me, the greatest example that I can recall recently is when I went to Bible college. I had this incredibly strong call from God that I could not deny. You have to go to college. So I went to college and I spent 3 years in college enjoying it, but wondering, why am I here? Because he didn't make it clear to me. I was like, am I here to be a pastor? Am I here to be a missionary? Am I here to be a chaplain? Am I here just to learn more so that I can be in lay ministry in the church? Why am I here, Lord? And I wrestled with him for 3 years, right? Until he finally revealed, this is the plan. But then I looked at some of my other friends and they were already pastors or pastoral interns and they'd gone in and they had their fiancés or their wives, and this was just part of the step which God had laid out clearly for them. And I thought, gee, that's unfair. That's unfair. Why do I have to struggle? So I really resonate with Abraham here when God says, this is what I want you to do, but it's not going to be a path which I'm going to lay everything out for you. I'm going to hold something back and you're just going to have to trust me, Abraham. It's the way he works with us sometimes. But God asks him, he says, take your son, your only son. And you think, well, what about Ishmael? Ishmael's not dead. He's off in the desert. He's married by now. We find that in the end of Genesis 21. But when God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac is the one through whom God made all the promises. He said, through Isaac will your line be named. So as far as God was concerned, Isaac is the only son. He's the one who he made come about. He says, Abraham, take your legacy, take your future, take your name, take your love, your laughter. His name means laughter, Isaac. Take that and sacrifice it. Cut it up and burn it to me on a mountain, which I'm going to show you. And Leonie's reaction is quite right. What sort of parent can hear that and go through with that? Especially an only child, a miraculous child, which you've been for decades, right? And it was decades between when God promised Isaac and when Isaac is actually born. And finally they enjoy some time. And now God's saying, all of this, destroy it for me. It's incredible. It's incredible. So we've got to ask, why does God do that? And I've got to wonder whether somehow in this time Isaac has become a bit more than he should in Abraham's life. Whether Isaac has himself become Abraham's joy. Where Isaac is Abraham's legacy instead of God being Abraham's legacy. We're not told, this is just speculation. But the danger here is that for each of us, family can become number one in our lives. Our kids can become number one, and they should be a priority, but they shouldn't be number one. Grandkids should be a priority, but they are not number one. Your husband or your wife should be a priority, but they are not number one. Jesus is number one, and they're second. God is first. And this is the same language Jesus uses. Matthew 10 verse 37, right? He says, whoever loves father or mother or daughter is not worthy of me. He's not saying don't love them, but he's saying compared to the love that you have for me, that should be almost as if you hate them. Right? Abraham, give up Isaac because I need to be the number one thing in your life. Why? Because Isaac won't last. If you put your trust in Isaac to be your future, one day Isaac's going to die. We're humans, we're weak, we're frail. The things that we put our trust in, the things that we want to go, this is what we're about, it doesn't last. It's meaningless. It's like chasing after smoke. God needs to be first. And so in verse 3 it says that Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering. He arose and went to the place which God had told him. Now these first words are so simple, right? Abraham rose early in the morning. That's it. It's God says, Abraham, go and do this. And Abraham wakes up the next morning and does it. Again, there's no arguing, there's no testing with a fleece. Is this really you? Abraham clearly hears God, and so what does he do? He gets up and he does it. He gets up and it says he prepares. God's told him, I want you to do this. And he doesn't go, well, maybe if God wants me to do this, God will supply the wood. No, Abraham cuts the wood, loads it up on the donkey, brings some servants because he thinks this could be a few days' travel, gathers everything, prepares, and then sets out on the mission that God has for him. There's no being crippled by doubt. God calls, Abraham goes. That's what it means. Here I am. The question we should be asking ourselves this morning, is God calling us to something? Is there something which we can recognize God's voice in our life, and he's been asking, whatever your name is? Are we answering, here I am? Or are we in that process of denying, delaying, I know it's you, God, but maybe there's another way around? Abraham's example is he gets ready and he goes. But this isn't blind faith. Because if we read this story from just a human perspective, it seems like blind faith, but the way we're seeing Abraham prepare for this journey says he's thinking about it. This isn't like a snap thing where God says, do this, Abraham does it, and then it's done, right? It's not like ripping the Band-Aid off. This is a long, well-thought process that's going to happen. Because verse 4, which I was actually tempted to skip over. Right? I was tempted to skip over verse 4 because it's a short one. It doesn't seem to do much. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar. But then I realized as I was going through it, it's been 3 days. 3 days where Abraham's been agonizing over the fact that he's going to have to offer his son on an altar in a gruesome way. 3 days Abraham has had the opportunity to back out. 3 days, just this internal conflict. I struggle with big decisions in life, right? I'm sure many of us do. You're like, oh, should I do it? Shouldn't I do it? But he's got 3 days of the hardest decision of his life. At any moment, Abraham could have turned around and said no. Any moment. See, this isn't something he goes into blindly. This isn't something that Abraham just does as a leap of faith, as it were. This is carefully calculated. There's something going on in Abraham's head. Something's driving Abraham. And the question we need to ask is he a sociopath? Right? He's had 3 days to think about killing his son, to go through with it. We would think, and many people when they hear, who are non-Christians, who know nothing about the Bible or God's love, when they hear this story, they think, what's wrong with Abraham? Who could offer their son? And when you think about it, who could in 3 days keep planning this? There's something wrong with Abraham. But earlier in the passage, God says, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Abraham loves his son, yet something is driving him to be able to go and offer Isaac. So there's something more to the story that we haven't hit just yet, and we're going to get to what Abraham's secret is in a moment. Verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come to you. Now this is a quick note. Boy in Hebrew can mean anything from a young child all the way up to 30 years old. So we're not sure how old Isaac was. But I mentioned earlier, he's able to carry enough wood to completely burn him up. He's able to make a conversation with his father of, where's the lamb? You know, we're doing the sacrifice, where's the sacrifice? So he's got reasoning. So he's probably at least a teenager, maybe older. But Abraham says, stay here with the donkey, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come to you again. We're going to go worship. What an incredible thing to say. I'm going to sacrifice my son, and that's not just a casual thing I'm doing. This isn't just a command, but this is worship. Sacrifice as an act of worship. Like, this is hard. This is hard. What do we see worship as? Is worship sacrifice? Because worship, when it boils down to it, means falling down on knees. That's the Hebrew root of it. It's on your knees. It's surrender before a king. That's what worship is. It means I surrender my everything. So we come on a Sunday and we think, well, what we've just done in singing, that's worship. And we can have that mentality that we go out of, oh, the music wasn't really to my taste this morning. It was a little bit slow. The songs were a little bit down. Not really my thing. You know, worship wasn't great. No. Your heart wasn't great. Right? Worship is not the music. Worship is not even the words. Worship is not the singing. Worship is your heart attitude before God. Right? We can worship to just the words in Scripture. The music, the words, the lyrics, all of those aid in worship. And they are tools to help us worship, but they are not worship. Worship is your heart attitude before God. And if our heart attitude isn't that one of surrender that says, it doesn't matter whether these words are in a foreign language that I don't understand. If my heart is coming in obedience and if I'm down on my knees before God, that is worship. That's why Abraham can say, I can sacrifice my son. The most terrible, tragic thing I can think of. But because I'm surrendering to God, that is worship. That's Abraham's secret, why he can keep going. Because it's about God. It's not about him and his wants and his comforts and his needs. when we have that sort of attitude of worship, we can worship in the worst of times. And I think Job's probably our best example, right? Job has pretty much everything. He's got 7 kids, he's got loads of flocks, loads of animals, and everything gets taken away overnight. And in Job chapter 1, verses 21 to verse 22, when Job hears of the tragedy of his life, it says, Job arose, he tore his robe, he shaved his head and fell on the ground. Understandable. He's lost all his kids, he's lost everything. And he cursed God. No. Abraham fell on the ground and Job fell on the ground and he worshipped. And what did he say in verse 21? Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. How can you say blessed be the name of the Lord in the face of such loss? Because he recognized, I have nothing that God hasn't given me. Not even my kids. You know, we procreate. The act is a physical act or a scientific act if you can't have kids, naturally, right? But we're not the ones who do it. God's the one who brings life. Everything we have, every breath we have is a gift from God. You know, Job was too short when he said, naked I came, naked I go, right? It's like, God brought me. My every being, my every existence is purely because of him. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So letting go of the things that we treasure most for God, that can become worship. As Abraham says, this is worship. Now, I tend to find that pretty hard. You know, when God starts to put a finger on something in my life and said, hey Matt, this thing is starting to get a little bit bigger than me, where's its place? And then, so to me, I start to go, oh, all right, Lord, well, I guess I'll sacrifice this for you. You know, it's like this painful thing of, I'll give it up. That's not worship. Worship is this, I surrender. It's not supposed to be painful and hard because it's recognizing everything is his anyway. I'm just giving back what he's given. He is the God who provides. He is the faithful one. Abraham turns tragedy and he says this is actually worship. So the challenge for us is, how do we turn our desires? And when we surrender those desires to God, how do we turn that into worship? How do we recognize that everything is his and everything we give back to him, well, it always was his anyway? This worship is the key to why Abraham can go through it. Because look at the outcome that Abraham sees, right? The outcome that Abraham sees is, stay here with the donkey, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come to you again. For Abraham, there is no doubt in his mind that he and Isaac are coming back. How can this be if he's going to offer Isaac on the altar? But he is sure that he's coming back. You see, this isn't, as I said before, blind faith, because God's promised Abraham, as Byron preached on the covenant a few times before, that through Isaac, Abraham is going to be a blessing to the nations. Through Isaac, Abraham's name is going to be counted, right? How can that happen if Isaac is dead on an altar, right? So Abraham is convinced that somehow God is going to either save Isaac or bring him back to life or restore him to him. So this isn't Abraham going in, I'm going to lose my son, I'm going to lose everything, this is terrible. There is tragedy in his heart because it's hard, right? But at the same time, he knows he's going to receive him back. I think of the same way with Jesus, with Lazarus, right? When Lazarus dies and Jesus delays 3 days and comes and sees Mary and Martha, and then you get the shortest passage in our Bible, the shortest verse, which just says Jesus wept. And moments later, Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he still wept. There's still emotion to it. So Abraham, though he knows he's going to get Isaac back, it's still hard. But because he knows the promises of God, he's able to continue through. This is not blind faith, because Abraham has two options here. He can either say, God promised that through Isaac I would have uncountable nations. And he said that, but now he wants me to kill Isaac, so God must be super fickle and I can't trust God. That's one option that Abraham has. Or the other one is, God's asked me to do this, I don't understand it. I don't understand how he's going to ask me to sacrifice his promise and still work his promise, but I've seen the way that he's worked in my life. I've seen the way that he's protected me, that he's led me, that he's guided me. I've seen the way that Isaac himself was a miracle baby to 90-year-old parents, right? And I trust God. And Abraham chooses to trust God, not just out of whim, but because he's seen God at work in his life. And we see this trust, this knowing, illustrated well in Hebrews 11, verse 17 and on. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, who'd received the promises, and was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, which figuratively, he did receive him back. For Abraham, he was 100% convinced. I know God's promises. What he's asked me to do seems impossible, but I'm going to trust him. Verse 8, we see this in Genesis 22. We see this reinforced when Isaac asks, well, what about the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide. Abraham's convinced that God's got this. No matter how dark it seems, God's got this. So for us, as we look at a passage like this, we should be saying, well, Lord, here I am. This might seem ridiculous that you would ask me to do something and then now you're asking it to change. I don't see how you can work this. But if we have experienced God at work in our lives, if we can look back through and see, as we've just sung in Great is Our Faithfulness and in Promises, about how faithful God has been through our whole lives, then even if what God asks seems extreme, because of our relationship with him, we can trust him. Right? This isn't about going out and doing crazy things and saying, well, if I do this, God will do something. No, this is when God calls us to something we don't understand. We can trust him. Don't get caught up by foolish acts that you think God might be asking you. And I'm sure there's been plenty of damage done in churches over the years where people have seen what Abraham's done and gone, I'll just copy that. Abraham offered up his son. I'll do something big. I'll sell everything. I'll get rid of everything. When God isn't calling you to do that, it causes damage. Right? We do what God asks. We don't need to try and impress him. Right? He's not impressed, ever. Right? But when he asks, he wants us to obey. Verse 9. When they came to the place which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. I find it interesting that the narrative here speeds up so quickly, right? You've got this a few days ago, then you've got this period of 3 days of them walking, and then we've got this step by step of he places the wood, he puts it in order, he binds Isaac, he lifts the knife's about to fall, we're down to the millisecond here, right? The tension in the passage is palpable. And then God calls out, Abraham, Abraham. Right? It's a sense of urgency. Stop right now. Don't go any further. And Abraham says, Here I am. You see, here I am is not just a response to, Abraham, I want you to go and do this. Here I am is also a response to, I've called you to do something, but now I need you to stop. Right? It's obedience in doing, it's obedience in stopping. Here I am is obedience no matter what that looks like to God. Right? Don't hesitate to stop. And the thing I love is God sees exactly what's happening. He sees every act of devotion. He's not a millisecond late to stop Abraham, right? Everything we do for God, he sees. Every act of worship, every act of sacrifice, everything for him that he's asked us to do that we obey, he sees. He's not distracted by someone else's great, big, grand, public thing and misses out on our seemingly little thing. He's right there. He sees everything. Verse 13, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he looked back, and behold, him was a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. Abraham went and took the lamb and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day. On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. See, when Abraham's obedient to God and when he follows, it's not that God's provision is coming, it's that God's provision is there and waiting. Abraham just didn't see it. Right? When we follow God, his provision is there waiting. We just need to pray, Lord, help me lift my eyes up so I can see this provision that you've laid out for me. And then there's a very interesting sort of aside in verse 14 where it says, Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. Normally when we read in Genesis or even in Kings and chapters like that, when God does something, they say God has done this when they name a place. You'd expect it to be the Lord has provided, or the Lord provided would be what he called it. But no, Abraham says the Lord will provide. This isn't a present tense, this isn't a past tense, this is future. Abraham right here is prophesying the Lord will provide. And in fact, it says there's a saying that grew up out of that, which says, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Right? Which gets even more specific. And then when we look at, Abraham gets something wrong in this passage, because he says to Isaac, when Isaac asks, where's the sacrifice? Abraham says, well, God will provide the lamb. But God doesn't provide a lamb here. He provides a ram, right? Too old to be a lamb. Big enough for its horns to be grown. So this tells us there's something missing. If God will provide, and if he hasn't provided the lamb yet, it's pointing to a future fulfillment. And we see that with Jesus on the cross. See, this is the capstone of seeing Jesus in Genesis. Now, I don't like to go too overboard with seeing types between Genesis or in the Old Testament and New Testament, because it can be pretty dangerous unless the Bible makes it very clear that something is a type. But here we see that reinforced, because Galatians 3:16 says the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say two offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one. It says to your offspring who is Christ. It's Galatians 3:16 is saying that Isaac is a type of Christ. He's a foretelling. The action that Abraham and Isaac take is a prelude to the true thing that's going to take place on Calvary. What they do on Mount Moriah is a taste of what's going to happen in a Roman province called Judea, at the place of the skull, Golgotha, where the Father offers his Son for the sins of the world. And there are some parallels between Isaac and Jesus, and we'll quickly have a look at those. They're both miracle babies. Jesus, born to a virgin, that's impossible. Isaac, born to 90-year-old parents, that's impossible. God makes it happen. As Leonie pointed out, Isaac carries the wood on his back up to his place of sacrifice. Jesus walks up that same hill carrying the cross on his back. In both cases, Father has the knife in his hands. Right? The Father sent his Son to die. It was always Father's plan that Jesus would die. He takes culpability in that. It wasn't an accident that Jesus died. Father planned it. Father gave his Son. Mount Moriah, as I mentioned before, is actually what becomes known as Temple Mount. It foretells what's going to, after Genesis, we've got Exodus, then Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Numbers, and then all the way through to Kings and 2 Kings, and you've got Solomon builds a temple on what's going to become Mount Moriah, and sacrifices, lambs are offered, but even that is a pointer to Jesus, the Lamb of God, who will be offered on that mountain. And one more thing is that Isaac has been dead for 3 days. Think about it. From the time that Abraham is called, offer your son, and Abraham sets out, in his mind, Isaac's dead. In his mind, he's already lost his son. In his mind, he's already grieving for 3 days. Then on the third, he's given back his son. And that's what Hebrews 11 that we read earlier said. Figuratively, he did receive him back from the dead. The same way that Jesus rises from the dead in 3 days. And interestingly, I said this is a book of beginnings, but verse 2 of chapter 22 of Genesis is the first time the word love is mentioned in the entire Bible. The entire Bible. Not Adam and Eve, there's no mention of their love. No mention of anyone else's love. Doesn't even mention of God's love. The first mention of love in our Bible is Abraham, offer your son, your only son whom you love. Love is mentioned in the context of the Father loving his Son. Right? And this is actually continued when we get to the New Testament, because the first mention of the word love in the New Testament, in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in each of those Gospels, the first mention of that is after Jesus' baptism, where the voice calls out from heaven, "This is my Son whom I love." Old Testament and New Testament, first mention of love is the Father's love for his Son. And then when we get to John, because John doesn't have Jesus' baptism, the first mention of love in John is in chapter 3, in verse 16. For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, that whoever would believe would not perish but have eternal life. You see, the picture that's being painted is that Abraham and his love is pointing to a deeper reality of God and his love for his Son, his deep love for his Son. And then John puts a little hook on it and says, not only does he love his Son, but he loves you. He loves me so much that this Son who he loved so much, he would send to die for our sin. He would send to die so that we could live. Right? This has always been about God's love. This has always been about him. And John also mentions how much God loves the Son, because verse 35 of John 3 says, the Father loved the Son and has given all things into his hands. You see, he spared Isaac, but he didn't spare his own son. He spared Abraham the pain, but he didn't spare the pain for himself in order to save us. That's why we need the story of Abraham and Jesus reconciled, of what happened back then pointing towards Jesus. We need these to play together because it paints this great picture of God's love for us and his plan, which has always been his plan. You know, the takeaway from this, the grand takeaway, is that God gave his Son so we don't have to. God gave his Son so that we don't have to give on that level, because we couldn't. So when God calls out to us, when God brings a test, a refining, a strengthening in our lives, how do we respond? Do we respond like Abraham? Here I am. Do we respond like Jesus, the beloved Son? He answers the same way when God calls. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus agonizes over what's going to come, Jesus says, here I am. When he says, not my will, but yours. Because after Jesus surrenders and says, not my will, but yours be done, the third time, his face is set towards the cross and he doesn't look back. In the same way that when Abraham says, here I am, his face is set towards Mount Moriah and he doesn't look back. And just like Abraham, Jesus goes in knowing, like Jesus knows he's going to rise from the dead, right? He knows it. He said it to the disciples a number of times. I'm rising from the dead on the third day, I'll be back. But it's still painful. It still hurts to go through the trial. It's still a deep test. It's still a deep strengthening moment. But he knows. It's not blind faith. This is very worked out. When Jesus says, here I am, in the hardest moment of his life, he surrenders. He worships. He worships. You know, this testing and refining in our lives shows us where our love truly is. Are we blinded by things in this world? Have we gotten too comfortable? Have we had too good a season? Where our health becomes the main thing. I've got to look after my health. Maybe work becomes the main thing. I can't do this for you, God, because I'm just so busy at the moment and people are counting on me at work and I need all this, but I know you're calling, God, but I can't do that right now. As family become something that's blinded us of, Lord, I know you want me to serve that way, but I've got to look after the kids. I've got to look after the grandkids. I've got to deal with this. Lord, there's no way I can serve you and look after my kids. Look at Abraham's response. I can offer my son and you can bring him back. The impossible for you, God, that's not impossible. Possible for me, but possible for you. The reason why everything else needs to be second is because it all fades. It all fades. Only Jesus lasts. Even when we get to heaven, right? Jesus tells us that there will be no more marrying, there will be no more giving in marriage. We'll be like the angels, right? Even marriage only lasts until the new heaven and the new earth, right? Everything which we think is so strong is just a symbol of what is to come, because our marriage to God is the big, great connection that lasts for eternity. And the thing I love with this passage is it ends with God confirming his covenant to Abraham. Right? Something that had already been promised. Right? The covenant isn't, oh, you've passed the final test, so because you passed this test, then this will happen. No. As we heard a few weeks ago, God hammers this like 4 or 5 times in Genesis. This is my promise to you, Abraham. Not because of anything you've done, but because of what I'm doing. This is my promise that you've already done, right? So you offered your son, and it's not because you offered your son that you're saved, that you're going to have this generation. You have this generation following you because I promised it. That's how God works, right? It's the same sort of language we get in Romans 8:28. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose, right? All things will work together for the good. Why? Because he's called. It's his purpose. You see, tests aren't there to earn God's covenant, right? They're not there to earn his love, to earn his salvation, that if I fail this test that's happened in my life, if I have a moral failing, that suddenly that I'm out. I've lost God's favour. That if Abraham had failed to sacrifice Isaac, that it would have been out. No, because God already promised Abraham, and he has already promised you, and he's already promised me through Jesus on the cross, that whoever believes in Jesus and calls on his name, calls him Lord, will be saved. That's the promise. So when tests come, it's not about earning that. We've already got it. We've already got salvation. We've already got the covenant. Abraham already had it. But these tests are to strengthen us so we know deep down inside this is actually true. So we can look back and see God providing in the impossible. So we can look back and see that even when I give up what seems most valuable to me, God has got something even greater in store. And it's not really a sacrifice in the end, because it was all his to begin with. For Abraham, here I am meant total trust, even in the seemingly impossible. For Jesus, here I am meant obedience even in the face of death. What does here I am mean in your life? Where do you need to stop arguing and delaying with God? To sit back, recognize his faithfulness through our lives. And when he calls, and he's calling us, to stop and say, here I am.